I have returned. I am Kalis, the greatest warrior of them all, and I will control everything that you see and hear. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Rightful Heir, which is episode 23 of season 6 of Star Trek Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Next Generation one episode at a time. In this video I cover the 6th season episode Rightful Heir. So Rightful Heir is the episode where Worf has a crisis of faith and goes to a Klingon monastery in order to regain his faith. There he sees the savior of the Klingon people, who is their messiah that died over 1,000 years ago. Kalis appears to him, but it's not a vision. He's actually there. And then Kalis says that he wants to take his place as the rightful ruler of the Klingon Empire. So the Enterprise escorts Worf and Kalis towards the Klingon Empire, but is intercepted by Gowron, who is very much against this. He does not want to give up power and says that it is just the Klingon clerics trying to seize power for themselves, which creates a rift and is at risk of causing another Klingon civil war. Gowron challenges Kalis to hand-to-hand combat, which Gowron defeats him, which should not be possible if Kalis is the greatest warrior who ever lived. So, Worf does some investigating and finds out that Kalis is a clone created by the clerics using DNA from Kalis and implanting all the memories and stories that they have from scriptures into his mind. He sees this as, a disgrace, but after talking to Data about his sort of crisis of faith, and that he realizes a lot of Klingons aren't going to care because they're willing to make a leap of faith. So Worf goes to Gowron and Kalis with an alternative, that Kalis be named Emperor of the Klingon Empire, which is only a ceremonial position with no actual power. The actual power will remain with Gowron. It will be more of a figurehead who will be there to enrich the Klingons' sense of religion. And so they agree on these terms and everyone moves away happy. So first of all, I want to explain my intro because if you didn't get that intro, the same actor who plays Kalis in this episode also did the control voice for the 90s Outer Limits show. In fact, I watched the 90s Outer Limits, which I actually really like that show. I think it gets it's one of my favorite sci-fi shows. I like it more than like Firefly or Farscape or even Stargate. I think it's pretty good. But anyway, so I watched that a few years ago. Like the whole entire show is like 7 seasons, and so I had that voice stuck in my head every time Kalis talked. All I could hear was, "I can control everything that you see and hear." I couldn't help but hear the control voice every time he talked. But anywho, for this episode in particular, I always saw this as a meh episode. It's not bad, but it's not particularly good either. It's kind of okay. Now rewatching it, I did like it a little better than I thought, because it was one of the episodes I was like, oh, yeah, do I really need to watch this? This is another mediocre episode. But it's somewhat interesting. I think it definitely pales in comparison to the Klingon episodes done before this, like Reunion, Redemption, Sense of the Father, Mind's Eye, stuff like that. All that was much better. And so I remember when I saw this for the first time, it was very shortly after, since I just got into TNG the year before, it was very shortly after I saw those episodes and were really into it and saw them multiple times. And this one felt kind of like they were trying to recapture the feeling of those episodes and failing. But it was okay. Like, I don't think it's absolutely terrible. I think part of the reason why I feel disconnected to this episode is that it is based a lot on Klingon religion and Worf's crisis of faith. Now, I myself am a fairly secular individual who doesn't really care much about faith, and has never really been an important, like, consideration in my life, and so I find episodes of stories about it uninteresting, unrelatable. And so that aspect of, and I know that's just my personal taste, but that aspect of it always sort of alienated me from this episode, made it seem kind of boring. Like, oh yeah, was it Klingon religious people going around going, "We are Klingons! We are Klingons!" Yeah, I know. Everyone can see that very clearly with the bumps on your foreheads and whatnot. Like, what do you think you are, Bajorans? Do you think you're Betazoids? No, you're clans. Congratulations. You know which species you are. And I get it. He's trying to restore the Klingon heart or whatever, but I don't really care, to be honest. Now, the storyline, I don't know if this is true, but I heard a while ago that the original idea was what if in modern 24th century technology they could reconstruct Jesus. But of course, like, doing any sort of human religion is completely off bounds for Star Trek, which is something I agree with, by the way. But yeah, that's, so they're like, well, we can do alien religions though, so let's do Klingon Jesus. And plus that would be very controversial, even if you're not an atheist. That's an extremely controversial topic. A lot of people would have issues with that. But you make a Klingon Jesus, less offensive. And it was kind of based off of Jurassic Park, and it did remind me of it. And when I read the behind the scenes saying that the writer who pitched it as Worf's Jurassic Worf or something like that, because they're using the same technology to bring back the dinosaur, or similar, like using DNA samples to bring back the dinosaurs. They use the DNA sample to bring back Kahless. Now, how implausible this is, I don't really care. Like, I'm willing to suspend disbelief and just go with it, and like, okay, they clone Kahless. Because, to be fair, it is an interesting idea of what if they could clone a Messiah. And it's interesting that this was the twist, and I think this episode does a good job of portraying the intrigue of the mystery of who is this guy. Is it really Kahless who's really come back? Now, in Star Trek fashion, there's a scientific explanation for it, because I do like the scene with Riker is like, I can't believe that the man I just escorted to deck 12 is a supernatural being. And he's right to question that. And this kind of plays off, they mentioned birthright, and the part with Worf teaching the Klingon kids who didn't know anything about the culture what it means to be Klingon, and made him realize that does he really know what it means to be Klingon. Which I hated birthright more than this episode. That storyline makes sense. Like, that does make a degree of sense that Worf should have, in fact, challenged that. And that's part of my issue with Birthright, is they never even brought up the fact that he was not raised on the Klingon homeworld and was raised by humans. But I'm glad it's sort of coming up now that he's, like, questioning his faith. I don't really buy that scene at the end seemed to be there at the start of the episode, where Worf is in his quarters all cross-eyed and was late for his shift. It's funny that they get security guys and break his door down just because he's late for his shift. Because it's not like Worf to be late for his shift. But Picard dressing him down, I did appreciate. It's like because he actually kind of deserved to not give Worf credence. He even tells him off. He's like, "On your feet, Lieutenant," and he has to get up. And that him slacking off is not going to be tolerated. So I did like that aspect of it. Now, the whole thing with Worf going to Borath, yeah, I found that kind of boring. But I was wondering the whole time I was watching these scenes, where are the time crystals? Where are the time crystals kept? Where are the weird chambers that exist outside of linear time, where time meets it? How come Worf didn't go there? Huh? If you don't know what I'm talking about, then you probably haven't seen Discovery, which is... just call it something else. It's clearly not the same thing, and don't tell me, oh, it's simply changed over in 100 years or whatever. But anyway, that aside, besides the fact that the guy that they meet in this episode is Kahless and not Kalish. Again, don't get me started on fucking earlier seasons of Discovery and how they treated Klingons. It says Kalish. But anyway, it's Kahless. He even says his name is Kahless. But anyway, sorry. Yeah, I know. I found that kind of boring. And the thing with... I like that they have Gowron, because a lot of times they mention Gowron, but they don't actually show him. I used to think that Robert O'Reilly just didn't want to do the show that much, but in interviews and stuff, that doesn't seem the case. It seems to be like he wanted to do the show more. I guess the writers just didn't really want him around, because there's a lot of episodes where he's mentioned but never seen, such as in Unification, when they need a Klingon ship or whatever. It seemed to me like they were going out of their way not to show Gowron, but they bring him back for this episode, which... they do need to have him there, because it is important that they're just assuming that Kahless would take control of the Klingon Empire like that, which Gowron might have something to say about that. And so it does make sense, they just got over a civil war, that they would jump straight into another one. But on the other hand, the Kahless and those monks do have a point that the Klingon Empire has become corrupted and is controlled by a lot of corrupt individuals, and this will be touched on more in Deep Space Nine. And speaking of Deep Space Nine, Kahless is mentioned again after this episode several times as the Emperor, but kind of insignificant. So the big revelation that, he can fix corruption and reinvigorate the Klingon spirit, he obviously fails at that, because seeing where the Klingons go in DS9, where they become even more violent and more corrupt. Well, not more violent. Klingons are always violent. I mean, more corrupt and more despicable. So yeah, he fails miserably, and he's mentioned several times too. Because in the episode The Sword of Kahless, they talk about giving the sword to Kahless. That's their thing, to give it to the Emperor, but then they're like, no, it's mine. It's a typical Gold Fever storyline, which I'll get to when I get to that boring-ass episode. But anywho, they do mention him a lot in that episode. Also, Worf, in this episode, he talks about how there was a vision that he had of Kahless as younger. Actually, Kahless brings this up, saying where in his vision, Kahless said, "You will do something no Klingon has ever done." Now, in a deleted scene for this episode, Worf even goes on further to say that he has done something no Klingon has ever done, that he joined Starfleet. And then that is brought up again in the episode Sword of Kahless, where Worf is saying, I had a vision of Kahless when I was younger. He said I would do something no Klingon has ever done, and I've always thought that that was joining Starfleet, but now I see it's finding the Sword of Kahless. So they kind of reference a deleted scene in that episode, although it is kind of implied that is what Worf thinks, that he did something no Klingon has ever done. But yeah, so yeah, they don't really do much with Kalis in the future, so it does seem like this episode's kind of not important in the grand scheme of things. They just name drop him a couple of times, but yeah, he does seem to be worthless and not do any bit of good. Like, how is he supposed to solve corruption if power doesn't change and Gowron remains the power and he's just a figurehead? How does that solve corruption? How does that solve greed or sliminess or any of the other issues having to do with the Klingons? And as I said, he obviously doesn't change anything about the Klingon spirit either. So kind of a waste. Now, the scenes that I actually liked the most in this episode were the ones with Data. I thought this was a really interesting use of Data. That Data was the one who was talking to Worf about his faith. And I talked before a lot about how the best uses of Data is when he comes off as more than just a simple bop robot, where he's actually shown to be more sort of human. And so his little story about how he had a crisis of faith when he was first activated because he had to decide that he was more than just an automaton, that he could be more like he was a person that could grow and learn, and so he took a leap of faith even though he had no empirical evidence of that. I love that. I heard some other people criticize that. I think they're wrong. For me, it's easily the best part of the episode, and I love that is what inspires Worf to take a leap of faith. Or moreover, he realizes a lot of other Klingons are going to be willing to take a leap of faith, and so he comes up with this solution to resolve a civil war before it happens. So, yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything else to say about this episode. It is kind of blah, kind of meh, in my humble opinion. Anyway, so I'd now like to thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It does help me continue with my channel. I'd like to give a big special thanks to Antarius and Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you all both so very much for your very strong support. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Valls, Alessandro Miguelistio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very much for your support. So we have a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, "Rightful Heir, more like frightful scare." JK, this episode wasn't really scary. I like the world building about Klingon history. I really like these episodes that really dive in to an alien lore. Not a good episode story-wise, but cool to learn more about the Klingons. Yeah, it does kind of flesh out the Klingon culture a bit more, but at this point in the stage, I think they fleshed it out as enough that they needed to, where now this is just kind of superfluous, but whatever. That's just my opinion. Next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, "The biggest question about this episode is when Worf went to Borath to join the cult of Kalis, did he forget about his son Alexander for almost a month? I don't think Deanna Troi was in this episode. Maybe she was playing Mammy. Worf flip-flopped so many times and I lost count as I couldn't care less. I agree with Gowron until he decided to join the cult of Kalis. Riker had the best line in the episode. Riker, Worf, no offense, but I have trouble believing that the man I escorted to Deck 8 is supernatural. I'm going to make a terrible joke in the next TNG episode regarding Riker. So my rating is 4 when the cult of Kalis arrives and the storm only fools will join them out of 10. A bit harder in this episode than I am. I don't think it's fair to call it a cult of Kalis. especially Worf never really joins the cult of Kahless. It's not really a cult. I don't know. I think that's too strong of a word. And Gowron most certainly does not join the cult. He just agrees to a compromise in order to prevent a civil war. That's different. But anyway, that's just how I see it. Now, as far as whatever happened to Alexander, that is actually explained in a deleted scene. On the Blu-ray, they have a lot of deleted scenes for this episode, and one of them, they do mention Alexander by name, where Worf is talking to Kahless, and he specifically says, my son is on Earth visiting my adoptive parents. So there you go. That's always their excuse. Whenever they can't get Alexander or don't want to for an episode, they just be like, oh, he's on Earth. And that's always their go-to excuse. But yeah, in that scene, Kahless was even talking like, oh, he's raised by these aliens and you let him do that. And Worf defends himself and saying, no, I try to teach him the Klingon ways, but he must find his own way. And ultimately, Kahless says to Worf, it's like, I was doubting the fact that you live among all these aliens, but it's clear to me that you stayed true to being a Klingon. So, yeah. Somewhat interesting deleted scene. So next comment is from Ricky, who says, to me, I find this episode boring. There's not much to it, and I think resurrecting Kahless is completely pointless. I mean, he's never mentioned ever again after this episode. It should have an impact on the entire Klingon political situation. I wonder what Kahless thought when the Klingons and the Federation were at war for over a year in DS9. Did he even have any influence? And also in that stupid episode in Deep Space Nine, The Sword of Kahless, I don't think that these events were even mentioned, and yet all the Klingons were obsessed with the sword, and nobody mentioned, let's bring this to Kahless, it is his sword. So yeah, one of the weaker episodes of Season 6. By the way, this time around, I thought that clone Kahless sounded so familiar, and I looked it up, and he actually did the voiceover for the 90s The Outer Limits. My mind was blown. I couldn't believe it. It was the same guy. So anyways, my rating is 5 out of 10. Yeah, we now control the horizontal and the vertical. Anyway, yeah, I didn't recognize it either until I looked it up and saw. Because when I was watching The Outer Limits, I did my rewatch a couple years ago, the voice sounded familiar. So I was like, do I know this actor? And I looked it up, and it was Kahless. That's definitely not what I was thinking of. But anyway, just a slight correction. In The Sword of Kahless, they actually did mention Kahless. Several times, Worf and the other dude. What's the other dude from TOS? Something. Anyway, the two of them kept saying repeatedly that the plan was to give the sword to Kahless and it would help him unite the Empire. So that, in fact, was actually their plan, but eventually they're like, no, he's just a clone. He shouldn't have it. I should have it. And as I said, just a gold fever analogy, tireless gold fever. And as for when the Federation went to war with the Klingon Empire, so there was a brief war at the start of Season 5, which it's still, I try to erase that from canon in my head because it makes no sense and it was dumb. Part of the reason why I don't like Season 5 that much. But, so it was never mentioned. They never mentioned anything about Kahless in that time. But in the episode The Way of the Warrior, Worf said he was trying to contact people in the Empire, like his brother, and he said Emperor Kahless, but none of them were returning his calls, or none of them were answering him. So that was the mention of Kahless there. So that does imply that Kahless was totally on board with what Gowron was doing. Now, granted, he was just a figurehead and he had no power anyway, so I suppose he had to go along with what Gowron was doing, but still. he didn't object to it. He could have objected to it and tried to, rally the people, but he didn't. So I think that implies that he did agree with it. So yeah, but what use is this guy? I do agree with you though that this character should have been mentioned a lot more going forward. It's just a few slight toss you breadcrumbs, Easter eggs. Oh yeah, Kahless exists, but he seemed to have no impact on the Empire whatsoever. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, with Second Coming stories popular during this time, of course the TNG authors did it with Kahless for the Klingons, and had it to be a Worf story about seeking for spiritual belief, and it works well in my opinion. Of course, we knew there had to be a twist, and little did we know it would involve a clone. It just goes to show Gowron can have other potential enemies in the Klingon Empire, with the spiritual leaders apparently not with him, and of course Worf is at the locale that would end up being even more mystical with the time crystals when we get to Discovery. Still, this episode pales a bit compared to other strong bangers in Season 6. I mean, episodes like Frame of Mind are truly more mystical and spine-bending, I'd argue, with the addition of eeriness and question of sanity, versus, I guess, the feeling of elation of blood wine Kool-Aid compared to here. While references will be made of the Emperor once in an odd while in a couple of DS9 episodes, though we are left to wonder how the Kahless clone will fare in the age of Martok and beyond. I already see others giving it a less rating than I think it should. I'll give it 7 Kahless clones out of 10. Yeah, it is interesting to think how Kahless would fare once Martok was made Chancellor. I think that he's kind of irrelevant by then, honestly. I mean, if he allowed, because his whole point, they kept saying in this episode, the Empire is corrupt, he will fight the corruption, he will bring honor back, and he obviously failed because the Empire even became more corrupt under Gowron, and he had no effect. So if I were Martok, I would just fire him and be like, you're just a useless clone. Anyway, I don't know, or put him on some monastery, send him back to Barath and make him in charge of that. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, if there is one thing that we didn't need, it's a follow-up to Birthright, especially since I don't understand why Worf's beliefs are challenged by the events of that episode. At the start, I liked how Picard handled the situation and how Riker immediately acts when Worf is not showing up. This is how it should be, not like Face of the Enemy when Troy vanished unnoticed. The solution that Kahless is a clone is so obvious, it's incomprehensible why no one thought about it in the first place. It's nice to see Gowron again. In my opinion, Robert O'Reilly is a great actor. Why do the priests say that he is the last hope for the Empire? They have never mentioned there is a crisis of confidence in the Klingon Empire. So again, in this episode, the episode would have worked better if they made it part of a greater storyline. I wonder if the script is inspired by the legend of the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, 1155 through 1190, who is said to sleep in a cave but will one day return and bring a new golden age. This myth was so abused politically that almost no one knows it anymore today. The scenes with Data were a strong sign for a weak script, since their only function is to narrate to the audience what Worf is thinking at the moment. My rating is 5 out of 10. Without Gowron, it would only be a 4. I think that they base Kahless off of a lot of myth, so it's possible the one you mentioned was one of the inspirations, but I think it's kind of like, a combination of just general myths and general, like, it's loosely based on Jesus, but obviously they're taking other myths, like probably more from warrior cultures, I would imagine Norse mythology and stuff like that as well. So yeah, this could definitely be one of the considerations that were the inspiration for Kahless. Or maybe I'm giving the writers way too much credit. But as far as Troy in Face of the Enemy vanishing unnoticed, she was at a conference, so that I can buy. It's not like she was supposed to be on duty and missed her shift. It's that she left the ship for leave and saying, I'm going to this conference, I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks. And it was during those 2 weeks, so they're not going to check in with her. Like, when someone goes to the conference, it's not going to call them every single day. Are you still here? Are you still there? Are you alive? What are you doing? What are you doing right now? So I actually do buy that. But that being said, it seems like every time a character on, I was just going to say Next Generation, but basically any Star Trek show, when a character on any Star Trek show goes to a conference, they always get abducted. like, I guess you could assume they always go to conferences off screen and you never hear about it, but if you ever hear about someone going to a conference, something's going to happen to them. Like, they're going to get abducted, or if they go on vacation. I think Picard is the only one who successfully went on vacation without being abducted. Well, then there's, the Worf and Dax thing from Let He Use Without Sin, but that's, better not talked about at all. But yeah, it seems like whenever anyone goes on a conference, on vacation, something's bad's going to happen to them. They always get abducted. Like, Bashir gets abducted by Section 31. Geordi gets abducted by the Romulans. Troy gets abducted by the Romulans. Like, you can't. And even this random ambassador who's said to have gone on a vacation in the Risa, he was taken over by a changeling. So you just can't go. You can't go to any conferences. You'll be abducted. Anyway, so thank you very much, patrons, for your comments. So my rating for Rightful Heir out of 10 is going to be a 6 good. Yeah, this episode's fine. It's fine. It's somewhat interesting. As I said, the concept of bringing back a Messiah and as a clone, and then having it possibly start a Klingon civil war. It does reiterate how fragile the Klingon Empire is, which goes in line with what we've seen about it so far, so it's completely in line with it. And so Worf having this crisis of faith and having to come up with the compromise, somewhat interesting. I do like the data stuff. As I said, is easily my favorite part of the episode. But as for all the Klingons going, we are Klingon, and I'm like, all right, whatever. It's fine. I don't totally hate it, but it's kind of, yeah, it's there. This episode exists, and that's what I'll say about it. So yeah, I mean, good enough for me to give a positive rating, but the lowest positive rating that I've got, a 6 out of 10. Anyway, that is it for my review of Rightful Heir. So, let's see what's coming up next on my channel. Saturday will be my review for If Wishes Were Horses. Monday will be my review for Second Chances. Wednesday will be my review for The Forsaken. And then Thursday, my review for Dramatis Persona. So that is what's coming up next on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.